It's rolling.
Hello everyone, I'm Kathleen. This is the Berkeley Drupal Users Group session, and I'm giving a presentation today on Zen 5, Sass and Compass. What we'll do, I think, is do the presentation, and at the end when we have extra time, hopefully, if you ask a question, you can introduce yourself at that point. It's probably a mix of, it looks like Berkeley and up front that my presentation is up on SlideShare, so you don't have to take notes. Everything I'm showing here will be on SlideShare. If you go to slideshare.net/UCB Drupal, you'll see a presentation, BDUG responsive web theming. I work here at UC Berkeley in the organization formerly known as IST, the Software Engineering Team, along with several of my colleagues who are here, Brian, Caroline, Phil, Ethan, and that's all for today. And we can be reached at istdrupal@berkeley.edu. As far as an agenda, some of you may have attended John Albin Wilkins' presentation earlier this year. He gave an overview of responsive web. And he is the creator of the Zen theme, so I'll be talking about responsive web design. I'll cover some of the basics, and again, I think we probably have a range of folks in here, from folks who may be Drupal pros as well as other folks who are either new to Drupal theming or maybe new to web design. So I'm going to cover a couple basics quickly, and then I'll go into Zen 5, which is the responsive web base theme that we're using. I'll talk a little bit about CSS2 processing, show some examples of Sass and Compass, and then I'll walk through Zen Starter Kit, and then show a live demo, if all goes well, and then talk about a theme that we're working on. And then I'll open it up at the end if we have time for Q&A. And again, if we have time, I can open it up to general theming Q&A as well, so that can be answered. One thing just about myself is that I have had an off and on relationship with Drupal over the past 5 years. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I created a Drupal 5 theme and built a site in that. And then I went away and I didn't do Drupal for a long time. And a few years ago, I started working in Drupal 6 on a campus site where we overhauled a very large static site and moved it into Drupal 6. And then again, so once that was launched, I didn't really spend much time in Drupal for a while. And then earlier this year, I joined IST, and we're in the process of building out sites in Drupal 7. And so that's just to know that, you know, I'm sure many of you are aware, Drupal is one of these things that you can be a complete expert in the one thing that you've been currently looking at and know absolutely nothing about something else until you look at it. So that's why these communities are great, is that, you know, it's very nice to actually ask somebody else, have you ever tried this or have you looked at this? Because, again, very few people, unless you really read people every day, are familiar with everything in Drupal. And Drupal theming is certainly one of those areas that can be somewhat gnarly. It's not necessarily like any styling that you do in other static sites or in other frameworks. So again, I'm constantly learning things on a daily basis in Drupal theming as well. All right, with that, we'll get started. Websites. So once mobile devices started showing up, a lot of people's initial approach was to build a separate website for mobile devices. So your depending on what device you were using, it would be detected, and then you might send somebody to a mobile site for one purpose and then a regular site if they're on a desktop. And that still has some use cases. So in some cases, if you have an event, for example, or some news, you might not want the whole website. You might just want to build a mobile site. But what we found here at on campus is that most departments don't have the resources to maintain 2 separate sites. So the goal really is to have one site, but have it adapt or respond to various devices. If any of you attended DrupalCon in Denver this year, Luke Robluski gave a presentation as a keynote called Why Mobile Matters. And in that presentation, he compares mobile with babies. So he basically says that every day there are 371,000 babies being born, but there are 1.27 million mobile devices sold or activated per day. So many more devices as compared to babies. And you can find that presentation online if you want to read through. So responsive web design is something that I'm sure most of you have heard. The term was coined by Ethan Marcotte back in May of 2010, and you can find endless information online if you Google responsive web or responsive web design, it typically boils down to 3 parts. The use of CSS media queries, the use of fluid or flexible layouts, and flexible images. And usually with the goal of any of this is device independence. You want to have the same content that as people view it across different devices, it will, again, adapt or respond accordingly. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. So a lot of times you hear a lot about responsive websites, but you don't actually get it until you actually see it. So there's some nice online tools. We're going to look at a few. One is called responsinator.com. One is called responsivepx.com. And then again, there are articles like this one in Net Magazine that show you 50 fantastic tools on web design. That'll show you a lot of examples. So let's go ahead and actually look at a responsive site. All right, so this is actually the HR website. This was built several years ago, so it's not responsive. And I wanted to show you an example first of something that's not responsive. So this is the tool, responsivepx.com. And you can go there and then you can type in any URL, both a public site, you can even type your local sites that you're running, and it will then show you what it'll look like. So here I have a little widget that allows me to adjust the width. So if I start out at 1400 pixels wide, as I start to scale it down, you'll see that the content just gets cut off. So that's very typical, and if you're on a mobile device, usually what you'll find is you have to kind of zoom in, click on what you want, and then you might need to use scroll bars to navigate back and forth. Most of the websites, certainly at this campus, but I would imagine everywhere, are not responsive. Again, this is fairly new, and people are currently in the process of making their sites responsive. So if I do the same thing on a site that is responsive, this is a template of the working Berkeley theme that we're in the process of building. And so here you'll see that I start at 1400, and as I drag the widget down to show a smaller width, the content will start to change. So at some point, I've run out of room up here, so my department name will move over to the top corner, and my secondary links will move to the bottom. And as I continue to change the width, eventually the content will collapse to the point where I go to 320, which is a typical iPhone display. You'll see that all the content has collapsed into one column of information. And then on top of that, the menu is collapsed now that is accessible by a menu link that if I click on it, it'll open and expand. And similarly, the search bar collapses just down to a single icon, and I can use the search here. There's a quick links widget on this site, and it's still accessible here. But again, this is the exact same content, so as I increase it and make it bigger again, it's still the same content, and therefore the content editors don't have to again update and worry about having a separate site. So another tool is called responsinator.com. So similarly, if I actually plug in the same site in responsinator.com, this site is nice in that it actually will give you kind of little mock-ups, which are actually working mock-ups of what your site might look like in a number of devices. So for example, this is what an image would look like in an iPhone. Then you might decide to rotate your iPhone into landscape mode. They have a mock-up for what they call a crappy Android. Crappy Android in landscape mode. And then they have their nicer Android, again in landscape mode. And then it has some mock-ups for iPad and other tablets. So here's an iPad in regular mode. This is it turned to the side. And then this is their mock-up for Kindle. So it's not usually going to be perfect, but it's a good way to actually quickly see what your site might look like in various devices. And then, eventually you want to get your hand on as many devices as you can and actually do some real testing. So back to the slides. In terms of design examples, there's a website called Media Queries, and that's just a site that has a lot of examples of what people have done to make their sites responsive. So I encourage you to look at those. In terms of navigation patterns, you'll see also on the site I just demoed, we chose to collapse the menu to a single button that collapses and expands. That's one navigation panel. There are many others, and there are a couple links in this presentation to some of the different approaches for navigation patterns. Usually, the main thing you don't want to do is just hide your navigation, because then people get really frustrated that they are stuck on your mobile site and they can't get to some content. So, but there's many other ways to approach that. All right, a quick overview of media queries. CSS2 introduced the concept of media queries, and I'm sure you've seen that HTML files You might see some lines in your style sheets that have separate style sheets for screen and print, or you might have seen something that looks like this in your style sheet. In CSS3, CSS2 mainly people use it for, again, they might have a style sheet for screen and a style sheet for print. But in CSS3, the W3C extended this functionality, and this is where responsive web was born. It allows your media query to check for particular media features like width or height or color, and then you can tailor your styles, your CSS styles, to a specific range of devices without having to, again, change the content itself. There are 3 ways that media queries are typically implemented. One is via an @import rule in CSS, and there's an example here. You can also use it in the HTML link media attribute. But the most common way is to use it directly in the style sheet. And so this is some code that I just pasted in from Zen's responsive sidebar.css. And so typically, again, in your CSS, you'll have the media query. Here it's specifying if the min width is 480, then I list all the CSS styles for that media query underneath it. So again, it gives us a lot of flexibility. And we'll take a look at that as well. Fluid or flexible layouts. Before responsive web design, but still ongoing, there was extensive debate in the design world about whether sites should be fixed, fluid, or elastic. So again, in the first site that we demonstrated, that was fixed, and people liked fixed sites. Designers liked fixed sites because it gave them control and consistency. You could basically design once and ensure that across different devices and desktops it would look the same. And typically, you would specify, again, with pixels in that case. Fluid, which has been available for a long time, allows people to specify width by percentages, and that adjusts to the screen's user resolution. But again, in those cases, if people had very wide screens that they're viewing things on, sometimes designers didn't like the way that a site would render on a wide screen. So a lot of people chose, I'm going to fix it at 960. I don't care that you have 1600. You're going to get 960 for my site. Elastic is a term that's been used sometimes when people size elements with ems, so that's also relative, but it is based on font size. Responsive grids. So one of the things when you start actually doing some responsive web design is you might want to think about using a grid system. With fixed sites, people are very used to using things like the 960 grid system. There are plenty of available grid systems for responsive web, and you can Google and find a whole bunch of them. Suzy is a very common one that uses Compass. But John Albin Wilkins, in writing Zen 5, decided to write one of his own called Zen Grids. So it comes with Zen 5, so I figured I'd use it because I don't have to actually go find another grid solution. And he wrote it to be independent of Zen 5, so you can actually go and use Zen Grids in a static website. You don't even need Drupal, and vice versa. If you're using Zen 5 and you decide, though, I have a favorite grid solution that I want to use, you can easily swap it out and use your preferred grid system. So flexible images and media. Scaling images and video in CSS is straightforward. Typically, all you need to do is set max width to 100%, and that will actually take care of your images and your objects for video. There are performance considerations, though. In this case, you may be taking a bandwidth to serve a high-resolution image to a device that is using it. So you'll find, again, if you look online, there are some solutions to how people handle it. Frequently, it's in JavaScript code. They'll serve up the images depending on the device. So that's a background on, again, the 3 parts of responsive web. Now we're going to get into responsive-based themes. So responsive-based themes have been around in Drupal for a little bit. Zen is actually a little bit later to the game. The other common based themes include adaptive theme and Omega. And some of you might have played with some of these. Omega has really taken off and it's become really popular because it has the extensive front-end graphical user interface. So you can do a lot of the configuration within the GUI, and for folks who don't like to code, a lot of times for their specific website, they'll find it's really easy to just use the Omega GUI interface and configure their site that way. I've heard a lot of great things about adaptive theme as well. It's well documented, and there's a lot of sub-themes, but I have chosen Zen 5 for a number of reasons. One, I've used Zen 5 since I started looking at, not Zen 5, but I've used Zen since I started looking at Drupal theming back in Drupal 5, and I've always been impressed with it. Number one, it has terrific documentation. So John has done a tremendous job really documenting everything. His code is extremely well commented. And I've actually learned a lot about Drupal theme just by reading the comments in his code. Secondly, he puts a lot of thought into how he organizes files and where he puts things, and I appreciate his organization. And then he incorporates a lot of best practices. So for Zen 5 in particular, again, his Zen 5 release came earlier this year, and he said that, well, the reason it's taken me a while is that I spent a year putting in a lot of effort to try and find all these best practices and incorporating it. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, he saved me a lot of time, and I really like the way that he describes things as well. So you can look on the project page for some of the things that are included in this, but again, there's a whole mess of things that he's included by default in Zen 5. And again, you can use them or not use them. You can disable, swap out any of these as you want, and he provides that flexibility. On top of it, he seems like a nice guy, so. All right, CSS preprocessing. So if you haven't done any CSS preprocessing and you're somebody that styles web pages, I strongly encourage you to look into it. It's one of the more life-changing things if you actually spend a lot of time doing CSS styling. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is. So a lot of people, myself included, kind of shy away from learning it because you might say to yourself, well, I've already spent time, I know how to use CSS, I can pretty much wrangle it to do whatever I want. So why should I bother learning something else? And on top of it, I'm just so busy and I really don't have any time to learn something new. So that's kind of the general mind frame that a lot of people have. But what you learn when you actually even take an hour to look into it is that it's super easy to get started, and the flavors of CSS preprocessing now are pretty much just extensions of CSS. So you're free to use as little or as much of it as possible as desired. You don't have to necessarily become some Sass Compass expert to start using it. Your first thing might just be, I just want to use a variable for this one specific text color that I use all the time, and that could be it. So again, the learning curve might be over time you can become some crazy Zen Sass Compass pro, but initially, like I said, it takes about an hour to start using it, and once you start using it, for most people there's no going back. I pretty much just write everything in Sass now, and I don't even look at the CSS myself. So in terms of CSS flavors, Sass and Less are the two most common preprocessors that you might have heard of. Both of them allow you to write cleaner and easy to read code. Essentially, you end up running your Sass or your Less through your respective CSS preprocessor, and it transforms it into standard CSS. So at the end of the day, you can just write CSS, so there's, again, no need to really learn how to Sassify or Lessify code. One thing to note is that you don't have to run anything server-side. Primarily, these CSS preprocessors are development tools. You basically compile your Sass, and then you can just even leave that off your server. You can just, your live sites are running CSS. So it's not like you need something fancy that you got to tell your ISP to enable to use it. In terms of preferences, you can again find a lot of people commenting on Sass and Less online. Less started out in the JavaScript world. I chose Sass after doing a lot of research, and also because there's this thing called the Compass framework, which is pretty much a library of ready-to-use code that works really well with Sass. On top of it, Zen 5 comes with Sass and Compass, and so it was a logical choice for me, but again, I encourage you to look into whatever you like working in. All right, Sass. So Sass stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. There are a number of web pages as far as getting started, the main one being sasslang.com. If you go to sasslang.com/tutorial, you'll see them walk through some basics of Sass. One thing to note is Sass is written in Ruby, and you install it via the Ruby package manager, but you don't need to learn Ruby to use it. So that's kind of a barrier to entry. A lot of people think, okay, I don't have time, and on top of it, I certainly don't have time to go learn Ruby in order to use this. But the nice thing is you don't really need to know any Ruby outside of 2 commands, essentially, to get going. So I'll show you that as well. If you have Mac OS 10, the good news is Ruby is already installed. You can choose to update it if you're one of those folks who want to keep current, but I'm pretty sure that whatever version of Ruby you have will work. You don't have to do anything. So if you just launch a terminal and you check your Ruby version, if it comes back and shows that you have Ruby, you're pretty much ready to go. On the Windows side, there is a Ruby installer. I haven't tried it, but I assume it works. On Linux, there's a good chance you have Ruby installed as well. If not, it's easy to install by your favorite package manager. Once you have Ruby, again, you can verify that in your terminal, all you need to do is go to a terminal and type gen install Sass. And that'll install Sass via the Ruby package method of, it's just a Ruby gem, and so again, you install it, you wait for all the code to fly by, and then you're pretty much done. So one thing to note about Sass is that there are two syntaxes. The older syntax was had an extension of .sass, and so that came out of the world of folks who like to write in things like Camel, and they want to be terse and use indentations instead of braces and semicolons. But then when Less came out, Less basically positioned itself as, you don't have to learn a new way to write syntax, just write CSS. And so the Sass folks realized that that was an advantage to a lot of people. So now the default syntax for Sass is .scss, for sassy CSS. And essentially, again, any code that you write that's just regular CSS is valid as CSS. So you can just take a CSS file that you have, save it with the .scss extension, and nothing will complain, it'll actually work. So, again, both Sass and Less, default syntax is a superset of CSS. A lot of times my approach is that I will just add the CSS when I need it. So if I'm just quickly doing something, I might just go and put a couple of CSS styles in there. Or sometimes I might just firebug another site and I say, that's really cool, let me see what they did. I'll go grab their CSS code, paste it into my Sass file, see if it works, and then I will go back and then Sassify it by creating variables, mixins, and things like that, which I'll show you in a minute. All right, so some Sass examples. If you go to sasslang.com, again, we have extensive documentation, but there are 4 major things that they'll show on their homepage, and I'll just mention them briefly. The first thing is variables. So this is, again, pretty straightforward, and for some people just starting Sass, this might be all you ever do. You don't have to use anything else. You might just say, look, I just want to use this concept of Sass variables. And so, for example, if I'm using a color that has a hex value of 3BBVFCE, if that's used all over my website across multiple style sheets, you know, if somebody comes along, my boss says, you know, I don't really like that shade of blue, can you change it? Then you'll have to do a find replace, which isn't that hard, but you'll have to do it across all your style sheets. So, you know, one thing is if you forget, you might have, you know, people testing, you have a large website, and then at some point, you've already launched the site, and you go to a page and you say, whoa, what happened there? And you forgot again to change that hex value in that specific location. So in Sass, it's really easy. I can just say $blue, and that's just the syntax that's chosen for Sass. It's a little bit different in Less, so if you're using one or the other, you'll probably get confused and make lots of typos. But in Sass, $blue, $blue, and I just assign that to my hex value. And then similarly, I might say, you know, I'm using a lot of values that are divisible, that are start out to 16, I can divide that by 2, I can divide that by 4, etc. So I might choose to say I have a margin variable of 16 pixels. Once I have that, you can see in the next line, I have content navigation as my selector. And so for that class, I might say border color, and I just say then blue, rather than saying the number sign 3BBFCE. And then you can also use a whole mess of functions that you can use. You can actually say, oh, I want to use a darker shade at 9% of that blue. I don't typically use that kind of thing as well, but you can if you want to get fancy. And then same thing for the border. So for the border, I can say for my padding, rather than saying 8 pixels, I can say take that margin variable that I assigned and divide it by 2, etc. So you'll see on the right, the associated CSS that you'll get will have standard CSS that looks like what you're familiar with, but again, you'll find very quickly it's really easy to write using variables. The next concept is nesting. So in Sass, you can avoid repetition by nesting selectors within one another. So I'm sure if you've seen long CSS style sheets, particularly when people actually will just hit returns for every CSS rule and statement that they have, you end up with a really, really, really long CSS style sheet. So I used to actually be one of those folks who would try to put all of my property and values in the same line because I just hated scrolling so much. Because there's so much repetition in standard CSS. And especially as you start to kind of nest down, you'll just keep repeating these long selectors. So one of the things you can do here is nest your selectors. So for example, I might have a class for my table, .h1, And then rather than repeating again for my next CSS rule, I might actually just say nested. So I can put my margin and my TD with a class of LN in the same nested selector. So you can essentially put a brace and then you indent, and then you can actually just keep doing that and indent extensively. So you can do the same thing with font family, weight, and size. And you can just say font once, and then you can say family, weight, and size. This is, again, one of those things that once you start working, it's just a lot cleaner. I can say, let me just find everything that has to do with whatever my top level selector is, and then I can read the stuff nested down again, as opposed to repeating myself over and over. Sass is something called mixins, M-I-X-I-N-S, and what this allows you to do is reuse whole chunks of CSS properties for selectors. So you can define your own mixin, and then just later call that mixin, and it'll just basically take all that and stuff it into your CSS. So on this page, the first two parts on the left, where it says @mixin, that is where they are defining two mixins. So they have a mixin called table base, and then they have another mixin called left. And so you'll see that the first one, table base, has a whole bunch of stuff in there for TH and TD. That's pretty standard CSS. The second one I wanted to point out, they actually have left has parameters. So you can actually take arguments with your mixins as well. So I can say @mixin left, and pass it a value that I'm actually representing by the $dist, and then I do float left, margin left, dist. So all of that, the @mixins, I might actually just take that and store it in some separate file. Usually you wouldn't necessarily have the same CSS or the same Sass files you have. I store it in some separate file that might say like my custom mixins, and then I just don't worry about them, and then I just start using my mixins. So then on my Sass file, I might have something where I'm creating some styles for the ID data, and I can just say @include left 10 pixels. So that'll then go and say, okay, 10 pixels, let me pass that in as an argument, and then you'll see on the right, it'll actually, at the top, give you the float left and margin left 10 pixels. So same thing you can do @include table base, and it's smart enough to spit out the CSS for you. So again, we'll show some examples of that. Lastly is selector inheritance. This is probably the last thing that you'll start using among these four things that I'm showing you, but it is possible to tell one selector to inherit all the styles of another, again, to avoid repeating yourself. So here, for example, you might have a class error and define a border and a background for that. And then later, at the bottom, you might have a class bad error, and then you say @extend, and you call the error class there. And then it'll basically, for bad error, grab all the properties and values that you've already defined for error, and then add the additional border width. So again, all this might seem complicated to you if this is your first time seeing it, but just a reminder, like I said, if you've never done CSS before, you might want to start learning CSS before you get into Sass. But if you are comfortable and you've done a lot of CSS, you just want to start taking a look at Sass. And again, the first thing you might want to do is just take your variables that take your colors that you repeat everywhere and turn them into variables, and that's all you need to do. And then as you get more comfortable, again, you can add some of this additional functionality, and you'll find that within a very short time, it's saving you so much time that you'll wonder how you lived without it. All right, Compass. So Compass, which you can find information at compass.org, is an open source CSS authoring framework. Essentially, it uses Sass, and it's pretty much just a library of predefined mixins. So there's a lot of stuff that a lot of people want to do, like, for example, for a lot of the CSS3, like rounded corners, shadows, etc., you actually have to specify all those vendor prefixes, which can be very easy to make typos. And so Compass, for example, has a lot of those things where you never have to type vendor prefixes again. You can just use the Compass mixin that they provided for you, and it'll spit out all the right WebKit, Mozilla, etc. prefixes, and you don't have to worry about that. Installing Compass is just like installing Sass. So once you have Ruby, you just do launch a terminal and type gem install Compass. And in fact, if you haven't actually installed Sass, you don't even have to install Sass. Just install gem install Compass. Sass is a dependency. It'll install Sass along with you. Once you do that, if you type in the command line Compass help, it'll give you a list of the 5 primary commands, which are clean, compile, create, init, and watch. That's primarily for using it outside of Zen 5 and Drupal. Again, the nice thing about Zen 5 is John, Albin, Williams has already set everything up for you, so you're pretty much ready to go. The only two commands I ever use in working with Zen 5 are Compass Clean, which basically just wipes the slate. It'll just delete every CSS that you have. And then Compass Watch, which is just a way to say, watch this folder, and anytime I make a change, spit out the associated CSS file. Compass Watch is just an amazing thing. Once you start using it, I pretty much launch it and I leave it running for weeks on end. And basically, as I work in a Sass file, I hit save, and it just goes and spits out the CSS. And again, when I first started using Sass, I would then Alt-Tab and I would go read that CSS file and I'd find the line and I'd say, oh, what did they spit out? And I thought it was pretty interesting. At this point, I never actually look at the CSS. With Sass, you can set up a debugger, and so if I mess up the syntax, I can get a debug message that'll tell me what line that I messed it up on. But like I said, when I'm working, I pretty much just save the Sass, let it spit out the CSS, and then good to go. All right, so let's take a look at Compass. So for example, this is what some CSS might look like, and this is actual code from one of our projects, before Compass. So here, all I'm doing is I'm setting a background and I'm setting a border radius, and you'll see, if you've ever done this, that I need all these vendor prefixes, and again, there's lots of opportunity for typos. Once I'm using Compass, I can replace all of that with just this. So I have two lines, one that says @include background, and then that uses the Compass mixin for background, and then I do @include border, and in this case I'm just doing I want to round my top radiuses, so I say border top radius, and then I specify 5 pixels, and it spits out that previous page, and I don't even care because I've already forgotten how to do that in CSS. So the really nice thing is Compass, again, has tons of these mixins. Zen Grids is essentially a library of mixins as well, so you can actually leverage a lot of work that other people are doing in the community, as well as regular mixins, and it'll save you a lot of time. Okay, Compass, again, if you go to the compassstyle.org, there are a number of different modules that they've made available. One that's very commonly used is the CSS3 module, and again, you'll see that it does a number of things like border radius, background, shadow, font face, etc. And the nice thing about Compass, again, is very well documented, and they have examples, and I'll show you specifically how I would go about using examples. The last thing to mention is something that Compass provides in terms of generating image sprites. Some people have decided to use Sass Compass primarily for this feature alone because it's pretty much magic. It's really cool. As far as websites are concerned, you can get a performance boost if you fetch all your images at once rather than every icon has to be fetched separately. But in the past, this is difficult to create and manage. You might actually bring up Photoshop and then try to line them all up and then put guides and then measure them all and then hope that you get your code right. And so it might not be something you'd want to do. Baron Wanchers, if that's how you pronounce his name, had a blog post that has a quick demonstration of using sprites, and there's a full tutorial on the Compass website. But pretty much, you take all of your icons, you throw them in a folder, so in this case, he's throwing it in a folder called icons, and then there's just a couple lines that you use in terms of, here he's defining a mixin, but then essentially he's using his @include. And as soon as you do that, again, and you can look at his blog post or on the Compass documentation for the details, but the nice thing is it does all the work for you. So you just pretty much put your icons in one thing, you give it a name, and then it will actually go and calculate. So when you actually use it, so if you see at the bottom, sorry, on the right, if I actually assign my icon class now and Twitter, I have a mixin that I say include sprite CSS Twitter, and that'll automatically generate at the bottom this CSS style that actually says, here's the background, and it'll link to the ping that it generated. So you'll see it has icons, dash, and a whole bunch of stuff, numbers, and letters that it generated. But even more importantly, it'll figure out the position for you. So I don't know that, in this image, my Twitter icon might be at a specific location. Again, it'll do it for you. It sounds a lot more complicated than it is, and it's one of those things that when you try it, you just kind of, your jaw drops and you're like, wow, thanks. And so a lot of the stuff that Compass provides is just a lot of thanks to someone out there who's written this for me and just made my coding easier. All right, so Zen 5. Zen 5 is already set up to use Sass and Compass. And just like you use any flavor of Zen, they include in there for you, under the Zen folder, a folder called Starter Kit. The traditional way to get started is you copy that Starter Kit folder, which is found under Zen, and you place it in Sites All Themes with all the rest of the themes that you might use. So for example, I might call my theme Food, and I place it in Sites All Theme Food after I've copied it from the Zen Starter Kit. Then you rename, there's a file in there called starterkit.info.text. You just get rid of the .text at the end and rename it foo.info. And then you can open it, it's just a text file, and edit the name and description. And then the two things you'll want to do is in a file called template.php and a file called themesettings.php, you'll define replace for all instances of Starter Kit and replace it with foo. And then you just go to your admin appearance page and you set it. If you use Drush, which I highly recommend that you do, it's crazy easy. You just type Drush Zen, in quotes is what you want to call your theme as far as in the name, but then foo is actually the machine name. I tried that and was incredibly impressed that it goes ahead and does all the find replaces for you. So you can quickly set up lots of Zen sub-themes by using Drush. All right. So what we're going to do right now is just look through the Zen 5 files. So a lot of times, again, with Drupal theming, people have a hard time getting started. So I just wanted to go through what the standard files are, and then I will, again, do a very simple live demo of how I would start using Zen 5 so you can kind of get the gist of how easy it is. All right, so I'm going to switch to my, all right, so this is just my text editor, and this is the Zen Starter Kit files. So typically in here, all themes have a README. One of the nice things about Zen is, again, he has extensive documentation, so he explains how to set up a theme with Zen. You'll also have here typical Drupal files. You'll have a theme settings. This allows you to do a hook form alter on the system theme setting form and add your settings to the theme settings. Template.php. The nice thing again about using anything that John Albin writes is he has lots of explanations. So here he decided to include an overview of Drupal theming. So if you're new to Drupal theming, you can just kind of read through here and really get an overview of everything. Usually when I'm done with this, I'll select all this and just delete it because I don't want to actually continue to have to search down further in the file. But again, it's a really nice overview of Drupal theming. Besides that, he has a folder templates. This is where you would copy any of your template files, so the ones that end in .tpl.php. And so again, in his README, he explains where to find all of them. So typically, again, if I want to override any template file, I'll go find it. So I might go find the Zen templates page.tpl, copy it into my theme right here, and then I'll replace the names, and I can start overriding them there. There's a folder that he's already set up for JavaScript. So he's got a readme.txt, and he has a placeholder for adding some JavaScript or jQuery code. He's got a folder for images that you might want to use. Source, so if you have any Photoshop files that generate your images, that's where he suggests that you keep them. And then again, he's got CSS files. So one thing to know with the CSS files are he's actually gone through and documented these extensively as well. So if you want to get started with Zen and you really are just not interested in the whole Sass Compass thing, you can delete everything related to Sass and Compass and just use the CSS files. But the only thing to be sure of is if you choose that route, then if down the line you decide to learn Sass and Compass, you want to back up those CSS files, because obviously as soon as you start using Sass and Compass, for every file that has a extension .scss, if I compile or do a Compass watch, it'll generate a new CSS file. So if I had pages.scss over here and I had page.css, and I've already gone into page.css and made all sorts of changes right there in the CSS file, and then later I say, let me try the Sass Compass thing, and I generate new files, it'll wipe out what you previously have. So in general, obviously, if you do coding, you want to back up, but this is just to say that Sass Compass is great, but it's not required. You can certainly use Zen 5 without it, and just again, I would suggest in that case deleting all the Sass files, which I'll show you next. So Sass files. There's a folder here, a file here called config.rb. This is the Ruby configuration file. Again, Normally, if you were setting up your own setup, doing a static site, not using Drupal, you'd have to go in here and configure this yourself. For Zen 5, he's already done it for you. The only thing that I normally do in here is there's a line here that has the environment set to development. What that does is it generates CSS that's readable. If I switch it to production, it'll minify the CSS, which when you launch your production site, that's something you want to do as well as aggregating your CSS. But obviously, it's a lot harder to read minified CSS. So I leave that as set to development. And then there's also this lovely Sass Firebug plugin. And so I set this to true, typically. By default, it's set to false. Just by setting that, then if I go to Firebug and I have to install the plugin for Firebug, when I actually look at anything, it'll give me the SCSS line as opposed to the CSS line, which is a lot less useful to me because I don't even bother looking at the CSS, so I wouldn't even know where to find that. So those are the two, this is the configuration file. In Sass extensions, this is where you put the Zen grids. If you decide to use Zen grids, you can just ignore this folder, but if you wanted to use a different grid framework or grid solution, you can put it here. Sass, these are the primary files that you work with. So these are the Sass files. He's got a README that has a little helper on how do you actually develop a Sass and Compass. And then pretty much you'll just work in all the various SCS files. But as you look through it again, it looks a lot like CSS. All right? So we will show you, I will show you an example. All right, let me actually show you. Knowing that Murphy's Law as applied to live demos seems to rear its ugly head, I will try to do some stuff live to just show you that it's not as complicated as it may seem to get started. So this is a default Drupal 7 site where I've applied Zen 5 out of the box. So I just took a copy of the starter kit and I renamed it Foo. So this is my Foo theme. So one thing, just for anyone who's new to Drupal and theming, Zen is the most popular. I think it's got 700,000 downloads. It's the most popular Drupal theme, but it is intended to be a starter theme. It's not a finished theme. So sometimes people say, oh, I heard such great things about Zen, and then they're really disappointed that it looks very bare and not so fantastic. So that's intentional. It's not meant to be something that you're going to launch your production site on. It's meant for you to have a starting point so that you can create your own theme. So if you have no interest in creating your own theme, go find a free or commercial theme that you like and use that theme. If you want to try coding yourself, Zen is a great place to start. And so one thing I might recommend is just get yourself a local installation. If you use Acme Dev Desktop, it's a one-click install, but otherwise you can use MAMP, LAMP, etc. Once you have a local version of your a local web development environment, then go ahead and download Zen, and you can play with it just like I'm going to right now. So I'm going to launch Firebug. Firebug is one of the first to allow you to kind of look at other websites. It's an amazing tool. The other browsers have caught up, and Google Chrome has amazing developer tools now as well. But at this moment, there's only a Fire Sass plugin, so I still use Firebug because of that. So typically when you launch Firebug, you'll see the HTML for this specific page on the left, and you'll see the styles on the right. So if I want to look at something, I can click this icon, or I can right-click, and let's say I want to look at what this is right here. So you'll see that it highlighted that I have a div here with the ID navigation. Sounds good. So if I come over to the style section, you'll see that there is a file, navigation.scss, on line 47. They've already started, there's a navigation selector here where I can now add my style. So a lot of times I might just start playing and testing in Firebug. So I might say, all right, give me a background, and I'm just going to type, let's say, da da da. So that's some kind of gray, all right? And I'll say, oh, that's beautiful. Let me continue. So let me say now I'm going to give it a border, and I'll give it 2 pixels, and I'll make it a solid border, and I'm going to reverse this and give it this little hex value. All right? So I might actually do, again, some of this testing in Firebug, and I say, this is so fantastic, I want to commit this to code. All right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to find navigation.scss and go to line 47. So let me close starter kit. I'm going to go to my theme right now is food, and I'm going to go to Sass, and I'm going to bring up navigation. All right. So I'm going to go to line 47, and lo and behold, there actually is right here a navigation selector already in my file, and I'm going to type here. So I'm going to show you how to launch Sass and Compass. So right now, I'm in my directory, sites all themes /foo. One thing that I do up front is, and I'll just show you here. So right now in CSS, you'll see there are all these CSS files, block, comments, etc. So I'm going to come in here just because I don't know what I did last time, and I will start by doing a compass clean. So all I do is type compass clean, I hit enter, and it will remove all of those files. So they're gone. So again, if I had specific CSS code in there, I've just lost all that work. So you want to back that up. But I never put anything in CSS. I let Sass generate it. So you'll see in here, everything got removed except for there's this one file called Drupal7-reference.css. So that's something that John put in there to help us. It's just a reference file that actually tells you where to find all the Drupal core style sheets and everything else. And the reason that didn't get overridden is that I don't have anything in my Sass folder called Drupal7-reference.scss. So you can feel free to add CSS files as long as you don't add the parallel SCSS file, because then that'll write over it. So you could have a local.css or style.css if you wanted to leave that for somebody who wanted to add a couple of styles there. All right, so now that I've done this, the only command I need, and again, I launched this once and it stays up for weeks, is compass watch. As soon as I do this, you'll see it says change detected, and it finds basically every file that has a change, which is all of them because none of them existed, and it just generates them all. So it just spit out all the CSS files based on Sass. And now you'll see at the bottom it says compass is pulling for changes, press Control-C to stop. Again, I just leave it running all the time, and it's just waiting for me to make a change. So if I go now back to that original file we were looking at, navigation, on line 47, I can start typing here. So one thing to note in Sass as well is in traditional CSS, you would write a comment like this, right? If you program in any other language, it's a lot faster to write comments like this, right? But normally that's not a valid comment for CSS. In Sass, it is a valid comment, and even more, it's a comment just for the developer. So that's a kind of nice balance in that if I want a comment that I want actually in my CSS because it's for the end user, I'll put it in the traditional CSS commenting style. But if I just want to comment for myself, like this is stuff I added for a BDUG demo, then that's not going to actually get output in my eventual CSS, but it's there for me. So sometimes I actually will put things like the typical to-do or something like that, notes for myself, so that I can quickly find things that I have to go back and do. All right, so here, let's go back to this lovely thing I have. So I had here a background where I made this DA. All right, so I'm going to now say I want to commit this to my code, and I'm just going to say background DA. And then I'll do the same thing. I'm going to grab my whole border statement, and I basically paste that in here. All right, if I hit save now, and go back to my terminal, you'll see that it says overwrite CSS navigation.css. So it knows that I just saved to navigation.scss, and it spit out navigation.css. So all worked well. If I hit refresh, normally anything I do in Firebug is going to disappear on refresh. But if I now hit refresh, it's still there because I've actually written it. And you can actually see now, if I Firebug the same thing on line 47, these are the two items that I just put in. And so in Firebug, I can click them on and off to just see and confirm that that's what's causing that little gray box. All right? So let's actually now show you a quick variable. So in Sass, there's a file that John's included that has an underscore base.css. And anything that starts with an underscore is considered a Sass partial. So all that means is that it's not going to generate a underscore base.css. It's just there for development purposes, and that's a good place where you want to just keep all your variables, all your mixins, etc., in these underscore Sass partials, and you'll have to then import them out into all the rest of your Sass files, but you don't have to generate a CSS for anyone. So in here, he's already grouped them in a lot of different categories, and he's got a category called colors. So I might say here, my fancy gray, all right? So I want to actually use my fancy gray. And so you'll see at the top of this file does @import base. So it actually imports base. Give me 2 seconds and then I'll get back to your question. And so now if I go back down to what I just added, I'm just going to take this color, this hex value, and I'm going to assign it to my fancy gray. All right, so similarly, I can take this whole statement for the border, the whole value, and I can say my gray border, and then I can put this whole thing in here as well. All right, so again, I'm going to hit save, and now I want to just use from now on until forever. Oops. I'm going to use just this variable. So I'm going to now paste this back in here for my background, and then same thing, I'm going to take this whole my gray border, and I am going to use that for this border right here. Right? So again, I hit save. If I go watch my window, it said again, it detected a change and it overwrote my CSS navigation.css file. And now if I go back here again, it's still there. All right? And one thing to note though is that as far as debugging, if I have that development in my configuration set, let's say I added this to my navigation.css, but I forgot to define it, oops, in my border. So I'm going to comment this out. You'll see that here it just generated an error. So it says error, line 55, undefined variable, my gray border. If I don't look at the terminal output, if I refresh the page, it'll also output the debug message up here. So it's really nice that it just catches for you. You messed up your syntax. I say, oh, what line 55? I do this all the time, and I go back to here and I say, oh, what's the problem here? My gray border, I bet I didn't actually define that, and then I go and comment this, and this now will spit out. What it did here is, because base is imported into every other CSS file, it actually now pulls them and it says identify identical, they're all identical, and the only one that it overwrote is navigation.css. Before I proceed, Joe has a question.
Yeah, so is the underscore thing part of Zen or part of Sass?
Sass. So everything that you see language-wise is part of Sass. Zen, Compass again, so basically if Sass is the pre-processing language, so anything that you kind of see as far as like setting variables and doing mixins is part of Sass. Compass you can think of again as somebody wrote a bunch of mixin for you and you can use them. And then Zen just leverages all of this. So again, you can use Zen with Sass Compass. It's already set up to use Sass files, but you can again consider if you wanted to delete the Sass folder, delete Sass extensions, and delete the config.rb, you're back to a standard non-Sassified Zen file, and it'll still work as long as you haven't compiled anything yet. So once you've compiled Sass and you've tried to change it, again, those original Zen.css files will disappear. All right, any other questions before I go? All right, so let me show you Compass. This is the cool part. So I go to the Compass website, and I go to reference, right? And then I know that I want to use some of their little helpers for CSS3, which is in the CSS3 module. So I kind of read down here and I say, you know what, I want to round some corners. Let me go to border radius. All right, so they have a whole bunch of stuff. You can read all about this, but usually I just quickly look for examples because they look at the examples. So here's a little examples page on border radius, and it shows you on this page how to do boxes with all rounded corners or each corner at a time, etc. So if I come over here, there's an area that has Sass, SCSS, or if you want to use the old terse syntax, you can, and then this is what the CSS looks like. So I'm going to stay on the SCSS tab, and I'm going to come down here and I say, ooh, here's a really simple line that says at border radius includes 25 pixels. So I'm saying that they put together a nice little mix-in for me that allows me to say at border radius. So I'm just going to grab that line, and I'm going to add that right here where I've been in the process of adding my stuff. And I put add border radius, and I say maybe 25 pixels is a little too much. I'm going to round them at 15 pixels. So I hit save, and this should get familiar to you. If I go to my terminal window, it's now overwritten that navigation.css. I didn't make any errors. And now if I go back to my original page, and I hit refresh, I get a rounded area. And you'll see here, it knows what browser I'm in, so it just gave me now the statement border radius 15 pixels, etc. But again, it'll work for any browser and give you the appropriate vendor prefix. All right, so that's Compass. Let me show you a little about Zen Grids. So, all right, Zen Grids. You can go to zengrids.com, and again, this is a really easy to use way to do a grid solution in Zen. All you have to do is import Zen with the @import Zen, and that's just importing his file that has all his mixins. And you'll see that you basically set how many columns do I want for my grid. You set what your gutter width is, and then you basically use some of these mixins that he's come up with that say, I want to include a Zen grid item, and he's got syntax for how to use it. So let me just show you this as well. If I go to, what file is it in? It's his layout. So Zen comes with a file that says responsive sidebars.scss. And this is kind of similar to in earlier versions of Zen, if you're familiar with it, they have fixed and fluid layouts. So he has a standard fixed layout, and then now he has one called responsive sidebar, which is there as a starting point. You can get rid of it and use your own if you want. But I'm going to scroll all the way down, and so you'll see that he has a number of media queries that we covered, which basically says, here's some styles for a min width of 480. He set one up that's 480 to 959. But I'm going to go all the way to the bottom and say, okay, he's got a media query for anything that has a minimum width of 960 pixels. And so that's where I'm going to start. So by default, his layout has 5 columns, and then it says use this layout when there's only one sidebar, the left one. So my current layout actually only has one sidebar. And then he has in here, sidebar first, he uses his own mixin that says Zen grid item 42. And he explains what that is. So he says, I want this sidebar to span, oh sorry, this is the content. So this is actually, I want my content to span 4 columns and to start in the second column from the left. And then I want the sidebar itself to span 1 column and start in the first column. So that gives this layout that we see right here. This is 1 column right here, so there are 5 columns across my page. The first one is 1 column, and it starts in column 1, and then this is 4 columns starting in column 2. So if I want to change this now, I can say, well, you know what, let me get 10 columns instead. So I can just change up here, use Zen column count to 10. All right, and then for my content, let's say I wanted to start this in a halfway point. I can say span 5 columns starting in the 6th column.
Your base styles first, and then like a private mixing sheet, and then say, okay, work from here or what?
You know, if you're starting out, a lot of times my approach will be that I will just do it in CSS to get it to work. Because just like anything else, if you try to take shortcuts, and I do all these shortcuts, and then it doesn't work, I don't know where along the path I failed, right? So a lot of times I'll say, look, if I'm trying to get a design, either if it's my own design or somebody else gave me a Photoshop mock-up, first I'll just get it to work a lot of times just in standard CSS, just to at least, you know, to block it out, right? At that point, then I usually don't go very long, so almost like the same hour sometimes with it works. I might, you know, commit that to Git or at least just back it up somewhere. And when I'm theming, I back up all the time because you're kind of dealing with lots of different things. So I'll back it up and I'm like, I know this works. I'm like, this works, CSS, right? And then I basically now will say, I will sassify it immediately because I still know what it is. So then I'll say, okay, you know what, how can I make this a little easier to read, whether it's using variables or whatever. And then mixins a lot of times exactly are like reuse. So on a regular process, you might not necessarily start writing a lot of mixins unless you find yourself reusing like the same code everywhere, and then you say, wow, this would be a really easy way to clean this up. Let me actually create a mixin. But for Sass and Compass, for the most part, you're using other people's mixins, and that's why it's so great. I mean, you basically work in Zen grids that, for the most part, you're using their mixins just by doing @includes to include their mixins. You know, when you create your own, again, it'll usually be that now I've seen across, you know, I'm doing some code cleanup and I see that across a lot of different files I'm using the same thing, and can I simplify it? And then once you have the mixin and you know you have your own mixin, so just like if I invented the border radius mixin, then I will probably just start using my own mixin from that point forward. Yeah, but in terms of workflow, I always start, and like I said, just make sure it works first before you try to sassify anything, because otherwise, again, I don't know if I'm messing up Sass syntax or if I just got my CSS plain wrong in the first place. So I always want to make sure it works before I actually do it too. Sass. But it's very fast, like I said. It's just kind of like in the same process. And eventually, again, when you get used to writing Sass, a lot of times I will just go in and put the stuff in my Sass file, but I'm putting maybe CSS first. So my styles look like just standard CSS, and then I'll go and add the variables, etc. later. All right. So anyway, he's got the nifty things in here as well. In the interest of time, I won't go into them, but you can use Zen Clear if you wanted to start a new mix and all together. So you can see here, he's set up this first roll, and then if I do a Zen Clear, now I can actually say that I'm going to start my next set of Zen grid items here. So you basically can use that to lay out your whole page. He's talked extensively about this, and I haven't finished watching, but Acquia did a webinar last week at 6 in the morning Eastern time, so I don't know how many people woke up at 3 in the morning here to watch it, but it is available, and I think he covers Zen grids a lot more extensively, so I encourage you to go watch that. And then if you didn't attend the last BDUG session, he, I think, covered something similar that's on the DrupalCon Denver website, so you can watch that video. All right, let's get to, so production. If you're ready to move to production, his Sass README talks about what you need to do, but essentially what you'll want to do is, one, Compass clean, just to make sure you start with a clean set of files. And you want to go into that config.rb configuration file, and you'll want to uncomment and set your environment to production, which again will minify your CSS. And then, of course, you want to see turn on your CSS aggregation just through the normal Drupal setup. All right, tools, Sass for Firebug. You can find it as a Firebug plugin, Zen Grids. And then, if you really don't like the command line, so as you can see, even for those of you who are intimidated by command lines, particularly if you have a Macintosh, launch the terminal and you type Compass Watch once in a month, and maybe you'll type it again if you somehow crash your computer. But it's not a lot to type, right? And then you might use Compass Clean to clean it. But if for whatever reason you just don't want to ever launch a command line, there are some apps that'll make your life, I guess, easier. There's a Compass.app, which I think pretty much just gives you those Compass commands in a menu. And then there's also something built by the same folks called Fire App, which then also compiles other frameworks and nifty things. And then there's also something called CodeKit. I think both Fire App and CodeKit also will refresh your browser page for you. So if you don't want to hit refresh either, you can leave those running, and I think basically as you save, your browser automatically updates without your having hit F5. All right. Let me just show you quickly Berkeley Panoply, which is basically, we are in the process of building some sites for some campus departments, and we're using a theme that's based on Zen 5, and we're also using Panoply, which you can find at drupal.org/project/Panoply, which is something that the Pantheon Chapter 3 folks created to allow a panels interface. And if you've heard of Open Academy is based off Panoply. So if you don't need the Open Academy academic-specific stuff, Panoply will kind of give you a starting point if you want to use their panelized solution. So I'll go ahead and go there. All right, so first Panoply. Panoply essentially, again, will allow it's a nice thing for your end users. So sometimes your end users will say, it would be really nice if I could just change some of the layout, and getting them to use standard panels can be pretty complicated. And then certainly having a designer on the side who's constantly going to redo your CSS is also complicated. So Panoply allows you to do things like, for example, if I go to a specific page and this has a layout that has a left sidebar and then a main content area. When I customize this page, it has a in-place editor for panels and allows you to drag and drop. So you can drag like this content over here, and then you can add a new pane and then pick some information and then load them into the different panels. So it is just panels, but it's a more user-friendly version of panels. So again, if that's something you're interested in using, I recommend you checking it out. We're just starting to look at it in our group. You can also change layouts. So the Panoply folks have come up with a lot of predefined layouts that you can select. So if I want to flip the sidebar, I can, or if I want to have a bunch of crazy layouts, they have all these different layouts. And again, this will just set up different layouts for you to then load the information in the various panels. And it is panels, so you can come up with your own panel layouts if you want, or you can remove some of them. But again, it's a really nice starting point, and we appreciate the work that they've done in this area, and we're starting to look at it for our solutions. For the Berkeley theme, this is actually the theme applied to a standard Drupal site. And so again, this is all just Zen 5 based, but one of the things we've done is we have a standard area where the departments can enter their department names. We have an area for them to enter their parent organization. There's primary links. There's a primary link section here. There's an option if you want to include a drop-down menu, but you don't have to. There is secondary links up the top. We have a little quick links widgets where you can add quick parts. At the bottom, there's a place if you want to use the address share widget. There are areas to load into this footer section. There's 4 columns of information, standard footer, and then there's a place for social media links. So again, this is something that we created just using Zen 5 for Drupal 7 as a Panoply-based theme. Sorry, I'll try that again. This is something that we use Zen 5 for Drupal 7, and we're building a Zen 5-based theme. And so one thing that we're going to provide for our mission, so this is actually branded up towards our university, Berkeley, but we have an option here for the site owners to select some of the various pictures. So we have a number of photographers on campus, Tom Holford being one of them, and Business Administrative Services, and other university relations images that just has some really nice campus pictures. So we can have, you can actually preview and see some pictures of the campus library, or some trees, or we have basically a shot of Hearst Mining, and then, molecules of your science department, etc. So let's say I wanted to switch this to the bas-relief pattern. I can preview it here, switch it, and then I can set any additional settings that we've created here in terms of fonts, including the quick link. And then we have an area here for social media links. So as soon as you put your social media information in here, you'll get the associated icon on the bottom. So if I save configuration, then this is updated accordingly. So that's pretty much the theme that we're creating. And where we are is, this is something that is in progress. We're going to pilot with the theme and the Panoply solution starting this month with a number of the campus departments, administration and finance, office of chancellor, parking and transportation, and campus IT. And then, our goal is that once we've piloted the solutions and made them stable, we'll make them available to campus as well. So that's pretty much my presentation. It's, we have 15 minutes left for questions, so I'm happy to answer any questions specifically about Zen 5, Sass or Compass, but if we have no questions there, again, you can ask any general theming questions, and we'll see if anyone in the room can answer them. So, any questions?
Any
Yes.
relative strengths or weaknesses between Sass and Less?
You can again find lots of people commenting on it. For me, Less came out initially. If you wanted to, you can include the less.js JavaScript line, and it actually will, compile it on the fly. That's not usually the best for performance reasons. People again started using Less, I think, because they like the syntax. But in my research, more people are going towards Sass primarily because of the Compass framework. So I am a big fan of Sass. But they're similar. I mean, the main thing is the syntax, and so I think Less might use like add signs for variables or something like that. So I think if you kind of pick one, you want to work in one, otherwise you'll probably start messing your syntax up. But if you're using Zen 5, I would definitely choose Sass because it's already built in. But then in general, like I said, I think more and more people, I've seen a lot of people who've written about it, start out in Less and then jump over to the Sass Compass camp. Yes?
So if you have multiple people working and they're both using the Sass, how do you compile to the same directory without overriding people's changes there, or do you use Subversion in combination with that?
Yeah, so typically this is kind of a development tool. So I would actually, I would basically not have, unless you actually work really closely with somebody, I probably wouldn't suggest that you would each be compiling to the same folder. I would actually say that each of you should have your own local development environment, and then you actually just kind of work everything out there, and then you might even choose at the end of the day, and this is just a personal preference, if it's just one specific website, your production might only have the CSS, but I would probably want to commit obviously anything that you've worked on in terms of Sass, because
I
you
mean, I
know.
can see it working if each person's checking in their own dev environment and then committing. It would just be like making more changes to CSS.
Yeah, so exactly. I mean, I think you'd have to figure out a workflow, but I would definitely be careful of spitting out one or the other. Although, you know, to be honest, actually, the reason I'm hesitating is that we haven't run into this yet. So now that I'm thinking about it, if your Sass is consistent, you know, again, you don't really necessarily care about the CSS, so in theory, you could just work on the same Sass file and, you know, it'll overwrite the CSS, but if you're committing it, I mean, it should be like committing anything else, so you probably wouldn't necessarily have a problem with that. I haven't actually gone through that kind of workflow, but like I said, you know, if you're committing it, you can always just go back to the previous version, so I think as long as you actually are, you know, organized in terms of your approach with your colleagues that are styling alongside with you, it probably would work. But let me know. Other questions?
I have a small announcement, if that's okay.
Sure. Other questions or announcements?
Are you guys, has anybody here signed up for Bad Camp yet? There's a ton of people signed up for Bad Camp, right? There will be a mobile summit on Friday. John will be there. A number of other, I'm trying to get Hamaris to be there too, the Omega guy. Put them on a panel, have them like yell at each other or something. We'll be talking about this and a bunch of other stuff, both demos and theory and practice kind of stuff at Bad Camp. And also it's capped at attendance. There's an unreasonable number of people already signed up, so if you haven't signed up for it and you want to go, I would sign up for it too.
Any other questions? Yes.
You briefly mentioned responsive images, responsive design. Do you have any tips for best practices there?
So I've only just started looking into it, so I don't necessarily have a recommendation there yet.
Most of the stuff I've found is for scaling images, but it doesn't address the issue of delivering an optimized image for mobile content and
Yeah,
responsive.
The solutions there tend to be JavaScript based, but like I said, I haven't really looked into them extensively, but exactly for the just delivering the right image and not caring about performance, you know, the max width should work pretty well. Any other questions? All right, if there are no other questions, I'm happy to stay here for the next 10 minutes and answer any questions if you have individual questions. But otherwise, I really appreciate your time and good luck and have fun.
Can you put up the link to the
Yeah.
to the